So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thanks so much. We have a really great session lined up for you today. You're going to get to hear from two change management experts, Julia Filial and Brian Ham, today on embracing growth and change during leadership transitions in higher education. I'm Kate Klaus. I'm part of our marketing team here at Avap and super excited to have all of you with us today. We're going to get started in just a second. Just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Feel free to use that to send your questions in throughout the session. You can also use the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on that and we'll do our best to answer those in real time, but if not, we'll definitely get to those at the end of the session today. Also at the end of the session, you'll be directed to a quick survey. We would really appreciate your feedback there. And lastly, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available on our website within 2 business days. And everyone on the call today will get an email with a link to view that session. So for now, sit back, get comfortable, get ready to learn, and welcome Brian and Julia. I'll let you two take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. We're excited to have you join us this afternoon. We have a very packed agenda, so we're going to move relatively quickly through it. But we're going to start off with some introductions, talk a little bit about Avap and who we are, our why. Why are we here today? What was the nature of our project and what we've put together? Go through some objectives, our methodology, our findings and themes, which is probably the most important. We'll spend the most time there. And then a little bit more about Avap, specifically our advisory services and resources. And then we want to leave time at the end too for any questions. So as Kate shared, plug those into the Q&A box as you go along, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end. So to kick us off, a little bit about ourselves. My name is Brian Ham. I have about 20 years in higher ed, and I've been fortunate to work in a variety of institutions, a variety of states. Over that time, a variety of departments from enrollment management, academic affairs, student life. And so it's been a really exciting journey. So I'm glad to be able to share some of those lessons learned throughout my time in higher education. But for me, higher education really started very early on. I am a son of a first generation student who went through as an adult student, went working full time, going to night school, things that many of our students are doing today in higher education. So being on the in the family side of that and experiencing that and just seeing the trajectory that higher education, the impact that had, not only for my father and in his career and so forth, but what that brought to our whole family. So that's my passion, is I want to help others experience that, because higher education, it impacts more than just the individual. It impacts their family and impacts their future. And so that's just an exciting thing to be a part of and that transformational experience for others.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, colleagues. My name is Dr. Julia Filial. I'm a principal consultant for organizational change management at Avap. I, similar to Brian, had spent close to 20 years, just under 20 years in higher education. I held a variety of roles. I like to say that Brian and our experiences complement each other. Brian spent quite a bit of time in the student services and enrollment management side of higher education, whereas I spent the majority of my time on the academic affairs side of the house, so to speak. So I have experience working at a 4-year private institution in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. Go Birds, if you're a football fan. And then I transitioned and moved down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I spent 17 years working in a comprehensive community college offering select workforce education baccalaureate programs. So why don't I tell you a little bit about who I am and my educational higher education journey and my leadership journey. So back in, I want to say 2012, oh gosh, a decade ago, I actually set my mind on becoming a college president. And I made very strategic decisions throughout my career to take on new roles, either through promotion or sometimes through a linear move. And that was really to broaden my understanding of higher education and to deepen my understanding of the inner workings of a higher education institution. Throughout each of those transitions, I made sure to have a mentor, someone who was guiding me, someone that could really let me know what my next step should be, or if I were to make a lateral move, why that would help me. And really it was through that mentoring and that mentorship that I realized this is not a journey that I am solely traveling. It's a journey that many people go on. So you might think to yourself, well, Julia, a decade ago, you wanted to be a college president. Now you're a principal consultant. What happened? Well, honestly, the pandemic happened. And you know, I really started thinking about what I love most about my job. What is it that I love most about higher education? Brian spoke about his journey and being a first generation, or the child of a first generation college student. You know, my why, what I love about higher education is working with people. And that really led me to where I am now. And I made a huge career transition, again, with the guidance of a mentor, and jumped over into consulting, which I would love to tell you a little bit now about Avap. So if you can go to the next slide, Kate. Avap is a comprehensive management consulting firm. We, since 2006, have been helping organizations transform and meet their operational and business goals. We have over 200 customers that we work with, clients and partners that we work with in the areas of healthcare, nonprofit, government, and education. We have quite a few education partners. On the next slide, you can see the different types of change management and business transformation, data analytics, and technology implementations with our higher education clients that we have worked with and partnered with, and a really full life cycle services. Avap's mission is to successfully partner with our customers in pursuit of all of their digital transformations, delivering outcomes that are based services to support their business goals. Beyond digital transformations, though, we also help in things like change management, which is what Brian and I, that is the practice and pillar that we work in within Avap. So you might be thinking, okay, Julia, you told us a little bit about yourself. You told us a little bit about Avap. Why are we here today? Let's get to our why. So a hockey game. What does this have to do with a hockey game? Well, honestly, it all began at a hockey game. Back in April, I was attending a Florida Panthers game, and I ran into the president of the institution that I used to work at. And he and I started talking, and he challenged me, as he often did when I was working for him, which is a wonderful, he's a wonderful leader, not only in higher education, but in our community. And I tend to listen to him when he asks me to do something. So he challenged me to think about how I could take what I was doing in higher education for 2 decades, take my love of supporting people and helping people, and really looking at a space where he found there to be a potential gap, which is senior leadership transitions in higher education. You know, we're working in a time right now, even before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, where the landscape of higher education has changed drastically. And what we know today, what we've known for the last 300 years of higher education, is not going to be where we're headed. It's not going to be the same in the future. You know, and as individuals are making these senior leadership transitions, it's pretty high stakes, not just for them, but for the institution. So right around that time, I had the opportunity of meeting Brian for the first time. And I said, hey, Brian, do you want to work on a project with me? And for the last 6 months, we've been attached at the hip. Again, I really think our experience is complementary to each other. So I think we each bring a different perspective. My majority of my time being in the community college space, the majority of Brian's time being in the comprehensive university research one space as well. So thankfully he said yes. And Brian, do you want to tell our guests more about our why?
Absolutely. So we started to really look into this and take a deeper dive and speak to individuals that had made transitions in senior leadership over the last few years. And so we garnered some great insight along with doing our own research as well. And we found that there's a number of presidents are retiring, and also the length of tenure of a president is decreasing. So there's more and more transitions happening, and stakes are very high for presidents. There's a lot of expectations. There's performance-based funding. There's not a lot of time to get acclimated and get adjusted before really addressing some of those. And so the need to do that has shortened quite a bit from what it's historically been. And so there's so many priorities and so many things that a new president or new senior leader needs to engage with. Everything from, you see things here, cultivating relationships, there's priorities across multiple entities, internal, external, personal transitions and things too, as folks relocate and take on a new position in a new environment. And so we began to look into those a little bit more and find out, well, what does that look like? How does some of our experience and expertise, and where are there gaps? So we're going to jump into our session objectives to kind of explore that further. We have three main things we want to cover today. One is to develop and talk a little bit about just the understanding of all the changes and things that take place, all the things, factors at play with a senior transition for leadership, both individual, institutional, cultural factors that surround those positions, and then begin to see, well, what's the next steps? How do you begin to identify and assess priorities to make decisions and so forth? Again, there's lots of things vying for your time. There's more priorities oftentimes than there is time, and so how do you settle through some of those things, and then into implementation. So once some of those top priorities have been settled on and decided, that assessment's been done, then what does it look like to implement those? Higher education's in a very unique state right now. I was interviewing some individuals at an institution for a project I'm working on. They're going through a significant change, and one of the things I asked them was, what do you want leadership to know as this this transition and things are being planned out? And they said to have empathy. They've been through so much just as a staff, and it's really reflective of what we've heard across higher education. There's been tremendous turnover. Folks are having to work multiple positions while staffing positions are being filled. There's the Great Resignation. There's just so many things taking place, especially with COVID. There's just been a lot of transitions personally for individuals as well. And so that's a key thing to keep in mind, and that we'll talk about a little bit later as well.
So moving into our methodology, what have Brian and I been up to for the last 6 months? So, taking the challenge from my former president, talking with Brian, we said, okay, well, anecdotally, we know that this is happening. The clients we're working with, I have a colleague of mine right now, she's working at an institution where their president just retired after 60 years, 6 decades. They've had the same president. Right? So we know anecdotally that these major transitions are happening, but what is the research telling us? What is the literature telling us? So Brian and I did spend some time looking at, what is happening? What are the trends happening across the nation? We then took that research and we said, okay, well, let's hear about some lived experiences. Frankly, I'm a qualitative researcher at heart. I do love math, but I also love the stories behind the data points, right? So we reached out to a diverse group of sitting presidents as well as other executive leaders in higher education. We asked if they would sit down and talk to us about their recent journeys. All of them have had a transition within the last 5 to 6 years, and we really wanted to hear from them what worked well, what could have been better. We even had one who is in his second presidency, so he was able to give us a comparison of, what happened the first time he went through, and then what was different for him the second time. So then we looked at the research, we interviewed professionals, and then we analyzed the data. Okay, so what is this telling us? Are there any themes that are emerging across these diverse experiences that we just learned about over the summer? Are there themes that are matching the research? Are we seeing something different? So what is the analysis telling us? And then finally, we took what we learned, what we analyzed, what Brian and I know from our experience and our education, and we really want you all to leave today with recommendations on if you yourself are going through a transition soon, or you're working at an institution that for sure is going to be going through a presidential or even a senior leadership role like a provost or COO or CIO, we want you to leave today with some tangible recommendations and strategies that you can implement on your campus. So what did we find, right? And this is where Brian said we're going to spend most of our time. So we did, what did emerge from the data, both the research that we found and then the interviews that we conducted, are 4 themes. So what are these themes? Governance. Wow, this is a biggie. Both internal and external factors, whether it's something that's known or unknown prior to the transition, governance does play a key role in the transition of these leaders. Beyond governance, looking more internally, we're looking at the culture of the organization, the people, the processes, the tradition, the mission, the vision. And believe it or not, beyond that, it's also the culture in which the organization sits. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. How does that play a factor into how that leader is seen within that culture of that larger community outside of the organization? Next, we have partnerships. What are those established partnerships? What are the partnerships that have been identified? What are the partnerships that have are gaps and areas of opportunity? Again, as I mentioned, when I was on my own leadership journey, we don't do these things in silos, right? Unfortunately, higher education sometimes is known for working in silos, but really over time, we realized that that is just not a sustainable model. And we really do need to have those cross-functional, cross-disciplinary conversations. And we really need to establish partnerships both internally and externally to the organization. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And then finally, I think Brian touched on this a little bit already. What we're hearing from campuses, individuals on the campus, so those that our leaders are leading, they want a leader that sees them beyond their role of the institution. So what is the leader doing to build that trust, so that building the trust today so that they can achieve new outcomes in the future? So let's dig into these themes a little bit more. We'll start off with governance. Just to let you all know, you're not going to hear from me for the next 20 minutes. Brian and I are going to tag team these next couple of themes. What you're going to see on the next slide are some of the major items within the structure of governance. Kate, I don't know if you can go to the next slide when you get a chance. Perfect. All right, so I promise we're not going to touch on all 9 of these boxes. We are going to touch on 1 or 2 that really came out of the research as well as came out of our experience. So I'll go ahead and start. One of the presidents that we sat with, that we spoke to, found herself in a brand new state. She was originally from the East Coast, born and raised, knew her state in which she lived and grew up and went to school and raised her children. She knew her state very well. She knew the structure and the governance of the community college system well. And then she sought out and received an opportunity to be a president at a community college in a different state, goes to that state, and wow, the governance structure is completely different there, right? So she went from being a provost at a community college with really a local governing board. So there was a lot of expeditious and efficient decision-making that could happen at the local level, working with that local board. This new state she found herself in had a governing board at the state level. So there's a consortium of community colleges that she's now the president of one of those, and they all report up through a chancellor. So she shared with us that she wasn't saying that one way was better than the other. It was just different. And it wasn't necessarily something that she had a full understanding or scope of. She knew superficially that this was the governance structure, but once she got in there, she realized, okay, there's going to be some timing in terms of, say, decision making, or there's going to be more alliances that would be built between the presidents at the different institutions because of that structure that she now found herself in. So that's just one example of what we've seen in terms of making that transition, either again as a president, a provost, or a CIO, or another C-suite senior leader. understanding whether you have that local level of control. Is there a state level of control? Is there a mix? Because different states operate differently, especially if you're at a community college versus an institution. So Brian, do you want to share a little bit about unions?
Sure. That was a big theme that came up with some of the individuals we interviewed, was just that transition to unions. And one individual we spoke with in particular, they have 6 different unions at their institution, 6 different collective bargaining agreements. So learning to break those down and digest all of that information was quite a feat early on in their presidency, and something that was important for them to do, but something that also was not on their initial radar when they were first kind of transitioning and looking at things, about just the time and effort and energy that would take. Another individual shared a really interesting one where she took over from a president who was previously a labor attorney. So just the expectations there when it comes to unions and things, of what their president role was and what the function was with those, was very different, because her expertise and background was very different. That's a topic that came up in a number of individual interviews that we did, which is the amount of time and effort and energy it takes to understand the unions, the collective bargaining agreements, the governance structure overall.
One other feature before we move away from this slide is that when you're working within higher education, I'm not telling you something you don't know already, but it is critical to Brian's point in terms of the union and collective bargaining agreement. There's this concept of shared governance and faculty governance and co-governance, and really understanding the relationship. If you are at an institution that has a collective bargaining agreement with either your full-time faculty, or what we're seeing a trend now, many part-time adjunct faculty are also unionizing. And how does that play into the concept and the real understanding of shared governance at your institution? So just another key factor to keep in mind. As we move on to culture, I had mentioned that it's not just the culture of your institution individually. It's the culture in which you sit, your institution sits, right? The community in which your institution is in, your culture, your identity, yourself as a person, and what you're bringing to the institution. One of the presidents we sat with and we spoke to was very generous with his time. He also had grown up on the East Coast, spent some time in a couple different states and a couple different community colleges. So he had experience understanding, what something, an institution in the South may look like versus the North. Those were his 2 experiences. Then he found himself out in the Midwest and really talked to us, frankly, about some of the culture shock that he was facing. Not shock, that's too harsh of a word, cultural changes that he was facing, and how at the end of the day, and I so appreciate what he said, at the end of the day, he is who he is, and he brings all with him, all of his lived experiences and life experiences. And he knew that there were people in his community, both in his organization and in the larger surrounding area, that saw themselves in who he is. And, I think that was really, we have on the screen here the word aspirational. I think that was really vulnerable of him to recognize that his role as a leader at that institution and in that community goes beyond just the role of a president of a higher education institution. And it's really a role in the space of the community. So, we heard this from not just the presidents, but also some of the other senior leaders that we talked about, is that, you're not necessarily going to get to what your true culture is by just talking to some folks, right? So how do you have those deeper conversations? How do you get to the culture below the culture? How do we get to really talking to some more additional folks to have some sense making on what we're hearing? And we'll talk a little bit more about that and strategies that you can implement later on. But Brian, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about, the key performance indicators. Another great thing about higher ed, we love our acronyms. So forgive us for not spelling out KPIs there. But Brian, did you want to talk about data?
Yeah, absolutely. That was one thing that came up quite a bit with several presidents, is just understanding some of the key performance indicators of the previous administration. What was important to them? sometimes in a few situations, they didn't have any. One president shared that he was looking through what was the current strategic plan at the time of his transition, and it didn't have any key performance indicators. Sometimes there's challenges getting that data as well. Oftentimes institutions of higher education have multiple technology systems. And so data sometimes is often housed, it's kind of siloed, if you will, in those individual technology systems. And so to bring some of that together, sometimes they need to bring in some technology to do that. But to be able to engage in bringing in that information, there were some presidents shared, they couldn't get the data they wanted because of some of those siloed type technologies that were in place and how data was historically gathered and how it was pocketed. I really appreciated one president and just his candor. A lot of presidents are going through search processes, obviously, and search firms to land new positions. And he just described that experience as like speed dating to get married. And so, just the opportunities, things happen so fast. Sometimes it's hard to get that information or really have time that you want to spend with it. And so that was just a really key part of being able to make sure you kind of hopefully ask the right questions, get the right information, and start that process early because it does take time. Sometimes those questions, those pieces of data you may want as a senior executive aren't as readily available as maybe a previous institution or as maybe you think that they should be or would like them to be.
Another thing I want to add is that we heard this, I would say, throughout all of the interviews that we did, and we see it in the research, and we also see it, Brian and I speaking with stakeholders with the different partner projects that we're working on right now, is that this idea of bandwidth, limited bandwidth or initiative overload, right? So many presidents are eager to come in and to make their mark and to do something pretty substantial within their first 100 days, because that's usually a good marker for new presidents. And while that is true, and there are some colleges and universities that do need that immediate ramp up, what we also heard was a cautionary tale of try not to do everything within the first 100 days, really taking an inventory of what are the outstanding projects. Because, and Brian mentioned this earlier, we've gone through a lot of transition with our staff. The Great Resignation is something that's very real in higher education. So, how as a new leader, balancing what you want to do, or maybe what that the institution has to do, with some of the projects that are already existing, right? And is there a way that you can look at those initiatives and say, what is remaining? And what do we maybe let go of? And that does align with your strategic plan, but it goes beyond just the strategic plan and really just those day-to-day initiatives that are going on in the different areas. So, and then also protecting the bandwidth of your team and your resources at the institution, which also goes into trust, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So moving on to partnerships. Again, you'll hear me say it for the third time. These are not solo journeys. Higher education now more than ever is being held accountable. I see accountable as a positive word. Not everyone does, right? We know we have our accrediting bodies, regionally and local and programmatic accrediting bodies that have been keeping higher education in check in terms of our student admissions, our student graduation rates, our learning outcomes, how many of our graduates are getting jobs. All of that is very important. And we can't do that alone, isolated as an organization. We need partners, right? We need our K-12 system that's going to help us with articulation. We need, if we're a community college leader, we need our university partners so our students can continue on for a bachelor's degree or a professional graduate degree. We also need our workforce education partners. We want to make sure that we're graduating students that our business partners are going to want to hire. So all of these partnerships are critical to a leader being effective and meeting their success goals. So one of the presidents talked to us, and this is not a surprise if you know this president. She's an amazing planner. So one of the things, when she knew that she was transitioning into her presidency role, even before getting to her campus, she had already been working with her senior leadership team to have a series of meetings scheduled, both internally with senior leaders and equally as important with community members. And those that I just mentioned, K-12, workforce education, university partners, college partners, and local elected officials. And I don't think that that can be underscored enough. The role of a university and college president today has become very political. Again, political is not a bad word, right? It really is just understanding your role as the president of an institution and how that plays in to the larger economic growth and the economic mobility of the individuals within your counties of care or within your servicing districts. So I admired and really thought it was clearly it was intentional and also very smart of this individual who's going through this transition to not wait. Why wait, right? If you know that you're going to be there, let's go ahead and schedule these meetings now to start establishing these relationships, start cultivating these relationships, because ultimately at the end of the day, we're in this together in terms of supporting our community. Brian?
Absolutely. And the economic engines in the community, understanding those was definitely a theme that came out, and the institution itself as a role. Oftentimes in smaller communities, the institution may be one of the larger employers. And so you're not just leading an institution, you know, in thinking about teaching outcomes and learning outcomes, but also employment outcomes for your staff, for your faculty, and their role in the community. And as Julia mentioned, there's just a number of political dynamics that go in there, especially, you know, when it comes to elected officials, if it's election time, those things, and how institutions sometimes can appear aligned maybe with certain individuals or certain things, and they'll, you know, certain political items may get attached to the institution as part of that. So just how do you navigate those things? It's very difficult to do yourself. There's multiple partnerships to be cultivated. And so it's understanding, you know, kind of, you can't be everything to everyone. So where do we want to focus? And also who else can be leveraged within the institution? It's not fully the president's role to be that, play that partnership piece with everyone. You know, there's other individuals that can be leaned on for that. And so how do you go about examining that and determining that for your institution?
Brian, that reminds me of our own journey, right? So Brian and I have an amazing mentor and guide here at Avap, Leslie. And Leslie is the embodiment of what Brian was just talking about, really identifying, empowering, and providing the toolkit to your team so that they can also go and grow in their own professional development. Leslie does that to us. So just want to say kudos and thank you to her. And what we're seeing is that that's important. As Brian just said, there's still only, as far as I know, 24 hours in the day. Still only 7 days a week. So as a president, you and as a new senior leader, you can't be everywhere all the time with everyone. So it's really understanding who on your team, to Brian's point, that you can match up with these other partners to really grow and broaden your scope and your outreach. One of the presidents we talked about, and I know this is very near and dear to his heart, talked about the role of the institution and these partnerships. It's not, in his mind, I'm paraphrasing, success isn't when a student graduates. Success is well beyond graduation. What is that degree? What is that certification? What is that credential mean to that individual and that individual's family for generations to come, right? So what is the economic impact of individuals engaging with our institutions? And we have a responsibility as higher education administrators and leaders to ensure that the learning and the degree and the credential that individuals are earning from us is going to help them in the long run, right? So these partnerships, you know, our students, we should have had a slide on here for our students. Our students are a huge partner in all that we're doing here. So that, Brian, for the next webinar, we have to add a slide for students. So last but not least is really building trust. And maybe this is even more appropriate where our students should be, because our students are stakeholders in all that we're doing, as are our faculty, as are our staff. I truly believe, and it's not, maybe it's the 7 to 8 people that we spoke to for our session, and the hundreds of more that we have spoken to on our client site. And ultimately what it comes down to is this is a very personal journey. we can't divide or divorce who we are as people to what we bring to our profession. Yes, there's different aspects of ourselves that we bring, and there's different roles in which we play, different hats that we wear, different titles that we bring. But ultimately, at the end of the day, each of our presidents spoke about authenticity and being genuine. You know, one of our presidents discussed how she was excited. I wouldn't say anxious, because I don't think that woman ever gets anxious. She was excited about taking on a new challenge and moving to a new place where, you know, she was uprooting her family to go somewhere that they didn't have a network of individuals. And she knew that that would be a transition for them personally. And she knew that they could handle it. And she knew that they could handle it because of the trust that they had within their family. And what I would say is, and what we know from speaking to her, as well as individuals on her team, she brought that level of confidence, authenticity, genuineness to her new institution. And she wasn't sure at first, right? Are they going to, do they really know what they're getting into? Do they really know that they're getting all of me? And she told Brian and I just how well embraced she was, not just by her, again, her college community, but her larger, the larger community in which her family is living, working, being educated, going to school, shopping. You know, she brings her full self to all of those roles as a mother, as a president, as a community member, as a wife. And, you know, really, she talked about how as leaders, we can't stop being people. And when we're leading other people, as Brian had mentioned, and I had touched on earlier as well, our people want us to see them as people first, right? To really lead with empathy. And I'm not saying that you need to be friends with everyone. You can't be that, right? You're not selling ice cream. You're not going to make everyone happy. But you just really finding that balance of being genuine and being authentic, and also holding yourself accountable for making the hard decisions. And I think that comes with, if you're building up this trust and you maybe have to make a hard or challenging decision, your stakeholders, whether they're your students, your faculty, or your staff, will understand that you're coming from an informed decision making model, because you've used those data points and key indicators that Brian talked about earlier, and that, you know, positive or negative, that you'll be there to help this community get through whatever that change effort might be. Brian, did you want to touch on some things?
Yeah, trust came up as one of the top, if not the top item in our discussions. It's such a key part in planning and certainly rolling out any kind of changes or initiatives. And so one of the things that kind of came up is that it's difficult to do to accelerate, right? Building trust takes time. It's building relationships, it's building understanding. And so I thought one individual shared some great perspective on that. So as he was going into his second presidency, he knew and understood the importance of building trust, and that was going to be very key to his success and the institution's success. And so in his second tenure, he hired a coach, and he brought in an outside group to really help with doing some leadership assessment and team building with his executive staff. And he talked about how much that led into then more successful planning and really helped underline and expedite everything else that they wanted to do. But building that trust first and foremost was a key point. And again, that's something that can be challenging, especially on your own, because it does take time, energy, and effort to do that. And again, when we talk about this high stakes environment, oftentimes that time isn't given, right? Because there's high expectations there for folks to get in and begin making changes or begin performing. And so that's where engaging in outside support can really, really be beneficial.
So we've shared our themes and findings with you. We've touched on a few different things. Now what? Right? So we want this to be something that's actionable for you. So as we move on to the next slide, what Brian is going to share with us is what you can do as an individual if you're thinking about a leadership change for yourself, what you can do as an individual that's at an institution that's going to be thinking about a potential leadership change, either at the presidency level or anywhere else within your leadership organizational chart. And then the value that comes with having these intentional actions to support your institution and to support yourself through this change. Brian?
Absolutely, thank you. Oftentimes when we think about, new leadership coming in, we think about the individual, right? And oftentimes we may be in those positions ourselves. What do I need to do? What do I need to begin to look at? Some of these items are outlined here, meeting with leadership teams, gathering data, some of the things that we've talked about already. But there's things institutions can help do to prepare. And those are really key, especially when we want to accelerate the transition and really help our new leadership get on board. And then also there's things that add value and support. So again, this is not a solo journey, and oftentimes it helps to get additional support or expertise to assist in these endeavors, especially given the amount of things that are that often come in and perceive themselves as priorities. So we look at some of these. I'll look at the second one down there from the bottom, prioritize initial goals. So that might be an exercise that individual as a senior leader comes in. It might not be your very first thing. Certainly there's other things above that, but as you're going through that and you're setting some initial goals for yourselves, well, that's not just the individual. What are some things that the institution can do before new leadership arrives, knowing that they're going to want to set some initial goals and they're going to want some background to do that? So some things that institutions can do along those lines are, provide a really good update on current strategic plans. So as I mentioned, the one individual came in and he was like, there's not KPIs here for the strategic plan. So it was really hard for him to know, how are they measuring? How are they determining whether or not they're successful? So looking through those, revisiting those, sometimes those get put on a shelf, but bring those down. Looking at kind of doing some self-assessment where things stand and providing that insight and having that ready to go for new leadership can really expedite their transition. And then on value and support, what can be added to really help folks as they go through that process is that, examining organizational readiness. So is the organization ready to take on new change? What's kind of been, is there a lot of change fatigue there? Have they experienced a lot of things already where folks are kind of worn out? Maybe, you're the third president in the last 5 years. And so they're kind of like just looking like, okay, what's next? We're just going to sit back and watch. And certainly you can't be effective if folks are just sitting back and watching you. You need to engage them. And so that's where some outside support can really help to, do some true assessment and put a gauge and a value and some metrics around the organizational readiness, where to apply additional support to effectively manage change and effectively carry out some of the goals that you want to bring in to the institution. Even looking beyond that, communication pieces, there's certainly going to be things a new leader wants to communicate. As an institution, they can provide, communication decks. What are the most effective communication channels? What's historically been used? So it sets that new leadership up for some success, to know how to best engage the audience and stakeholders at the institution. And then where can value and support be added to that to make things go even better? That's bringing in expertise for communication, doing some building, maybe that's building out decks or building out speaking points and those kind of things, and helping to put some of those messages together in a really compelling fashion. That can really help and save a lot of time. A lot of these things, there's so many things. That's one of the biggest issues, is just having time to balance all of these. And so that additional support to really expedite that process is just instrumental from what we've heard from folks.
So
one
Brian,
individual.
No, you go.
But even how that information is shared. One individual, it was really funny. He was like, I was really excited to get all this information. The university had said, hey, we put together all this information for you. We have it here ready for you when you come in. Well, they gave it to him in big binders. And so he was like, I was not expecting that. I was expecting something digital that he could, look at home and go through and edit and cut and paste and things. Instead, he's got these big paper binders. So he's like, for the first few weeks of my presidency, I'm lugging around these giant binders, to and from the office from home. So sometimes it's even simple things like that, knowing how that information is going to be shared, what's the medium for that, so that it fits what that new leadership is looking for. Go ahead, Julia.
I'm sorry to have talked over you there, Brian, and thank you for bringing up the binders. I remember thinking, wait, what year are we in? But anyways, so just to really kind of bring in a little bit of my own experience, I was, grateful to be part of what was called a transition team, a presidential transition team at the institution that I worked at, and really just want to give you an idea as to what did that mean and why was that set up. So at the time, I was part of an executive leadership professional development, and we had a new president who was coming in, or our former president had announced his retirement, and he had been with us for a decade. So we were kind of in that cruise control mode. And here's what's interesting. Our new president was already at the institution and already been there for quite a few years. So it wasn't necessarily that we needed to help him understand the institution or even to understand the community in which we sat or our strategic plan, because he was an internal, he was already an employee there. But yet it was still important for us to have a transition team, because he was moving from his one role with one perspective, with one very clear vision, because that was what an area he was leading, to now leading the entire institution. So we really needed to be able to provide him a more comprehensive, wide understanding of the areas of strength and the areas of opportunity for each of our major departments. So this small transition team, it's always a small but mighty team, right? The small transition team really worked with the leadership in all of the different departments around the college, and pretty much did a SWOT analysis. What are your strengths? What are your, we don't like to use the weakness word, but what are your areas of opportunity? Some maybe risks that are in your area. And we compiled them in a standard format, digital format. There's not a binder, but then we were able to provide that to the president day one. So he was able to really have a better understanding, again, as I said, moving from his previous role, which was more limited in scope, to having more of a wider understanding as to what was going to happen now that he was president. And we're really focused there internally, believe it or not, on the different departments that maybe he hadn't interacted very much with. As it relates to the communication that Brian was talking about and the different communication channels, a lot of the research tells us that a really important thing for presidents right now is to be present on their campuses, right? So how does that communication play? Are you doing, biscuits with the president? Or are you doing brunch with the president? Are you doing different presidential speaking opportunities, one-on-one, maybe with your faculty senate? How are you getting to your students, going to where your students are and not expecting your students to come to you? And I think that's really, I just want to underscore what Brian said about the different communication channels, right? So going to where people are already meeting, asking to join their agenda, getting people to make sure that they know that you'll be willing to come to them, in addition to them coming to you when you call a meeting, or have a state of the college or state of the institution address. So really just want to use those two as examples of what we've seen work really well to support these different presidential and other senior leadership transitions. So moving on, Brian and I really just want to talk about, Brian mentioned that there's a limited time for these transitions to really ramp up, the 30, 60, 90 days before, the 30, 60, 90, 100 days after. So really, we want to just let you know ways that we could support you from an Avap change approach model. If you can go to the next slide, Kate. Really, what we have focused on today is this first pillar of assess and align, because that's what we're going to be doing during this initial transition phase. But then how do we help you move from your transition phase into your plan and action and activate phase? And then how do we always incorporate metrics to measure and sustain these different change opportunities that you're going through on your campus? So, if you want to be if you want more information, the next slide gives you a little bit more information about the different areas that Avap does work in. As I mentioned previously, when we started this conversation, we do work in digital transformation. So if your organization is considering a new ERP system or a new student information system, we can absolutely help you with that. But we can also help you with these leadership transitions or other cultural transformations that are going on your campus. Have you done an academic inventory of the different programs that you have? Are you considering a new academic program of study? Do you need support in doing kind of workforce analysis? Are you going through an organizational restructuring? Do you need some help with organizational design? Are you interested in building a change capacity within your own group? We would love for you to learn more about our change approach and our change academy and on ways that you can build this model within your own institutions. So I'm happy now to take any questions from the audience if you may have some. Kate, I hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. I think that was a really great session. A lot of really well thought out content. It was so interesting to hear some of the insights from those interviews that you had. Hopefully some things that you can all take back and use in your transitions. So I do see a couple questions coming in. Please feel free to continue dropping those in the Q&A. Again, if you do want to learn any more about the topic today, you can email Julia or Brian. Their information is now up on the screen. And then just really quick, we do have our next and final webinar of 2022 coming up on December 7th at 2:30 Eastern. And this one will be on the topic of preventing fraud, waste, and abuse with analytics. Although it's geared towards government, it's certainly applicable to any public sector industry, including higher ed. So we'd love to have all of you join us for that. You can register at avap.com/events. So Julia and Brian, ready for some questions? Awesome. Okay, so we'll start with the first one. With the transition to more remote working environments in higher ed as a result of the pandemic, how have you seen this impact the transition for senior leadership?
Yeah, it's interesting that that question came up because quite a few of the individuals we spoke with transitions during the pandemic, and so their experience, the mechanisms that we typically use to build relationships and do things like build trust, it's hard to do when folks aren't there in person. So you're doing that through a remote environment, and that's where some of the, I think one individual who brought in some outside support for that to do some of that that analysis, where folks could do some self-analysis about their leadership abilities and their individual strengths and their desires and aspirations for their areas, and then bring that together. They did come together as a group and so forth, but doing some of that legwork ahead of time allowed them to help facilitate that quicker and in a kind of more effective manner. Julie, I know if you want to chime in with some additional things.
Yeah, for sure, Brian. Thank you. So 2 quick things that come to my mind are one, higher education institutions for at least the last, I guess it's now 30 years. I was going to say 20 years. For the last 30 years has engaged in learning in different modalities, right? I'm not saying that managing or leading in different modalities is the same as teaching a class that's either hybrid or online. But what I would challenge us is, let's have a conversation with our faculty. What approaches do they do to be more intentional with engaging with their students in an online environment? And how can we do that as leaders? How can we engage our employees who are maybe working virtually or our employees that are working in a hybrid fashion? I also will say that things like that don't happen by chance. And we see that also with change management. Things don't happen by chance. So you need to be really intentional and deliberate with your different engagements for your staff that are working remotely and those that are working hybrid. Building that trust and having that culture, you want to ensure as best you can that there are standards of experiences across the different modalities in which people are working now. It does provide a really interesting opportunity and challenge. Again, that's another word that I think is a positive word, a unique challenge for leaders now as we move into this hybrid work environment into the future.
Definitely.
Yeah, one individual shared there's benefits to that as well. So, as a new leader, they were transitioning states and so forth. And so being able to engage in meetings while they were transitioning, because they didn't know sometimes where they were going to be as they were moving their family and so forth, allow them to continuously be involved and so forth throughout their individual transitions.
So along those same lines, another question, when should an institution begin to create that leadership transition plan, and which department should lead that?
Brian, you want me to start that one?
Please.
Sure. So Kate, I would say we have to try to be as proactive as we possibly can. So, again, the Inside Higher Ed articles that we've been reading over the last several years has told us that institutions really should be preparing now for some type of a transition. Maybe it's not at your presidency level, maybe it's more at your provost or other C-suite level positions. But we have a growing number of presidents that have either announced their retirements already or have announced their resignations. So institutions are going to be experiencing these changes more frequently over the next few years, because another data point is telling us that presidents and other senior leaders are not staying in positions as long as they previously have. It's now, I think, just over 6 years. So not only are we going to have individual institutions experiencing this soon because of the resignations and retirements we're seeing, we're also going to be having institutions going through this process more regularly. So I think what I would recommend, Kate, is one of my favorite quotes that I tell my children all the time is, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. So by building an internal process and plan for how to really support any type of transition in leadership, I'm really not saying that you have to do these strategies all the time, but if you have a process and you have a plan that's in place that you can then implement when your institution's going through that, would really be one of the best recommendations that I could put forth. Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sooner the better, certainly. But benchmarking current practices, current policies, current procedures, status of relationships, partnerships with other entities. And that's important just for even transitional things that take place at some of those positions too. Like if you have all of your relationships are tied to one individual and that one individual's kind of fostered all those partnerships and that individual leaves, what's the succession plan for maintaining those partnerships? So it goes beyond just even, a transition in presidency, but thinking about benchmarking and documenting those types of relationships, the types of practices, procedures throughout the organization and throughout different levels. So really, I think it's each department, if they kind of do that on their own, looking at what their KPIs are, and then there does need to be, I think, a higher level, whether that's the president's cabinet or someone looking at some of those more collectively to see how do those fit into the strategic plan. What are what's the status of the strategic plan? If someone came in and asked them, those are questions they want to be able to be readily available for individuals.
One other thing I'll add, Kate, and I know we're almost at time, I want to make sure we have additional questions if necessary, but you asked specifically, right, which department, and I do agree with Brian that each department has its own responsibility in this process. What I would say, again, my former president, in his ultimate wisdom, he reconsidered how we look at human resources within higher education. And he really kind of rebranded our human resources to be called what was talent. It's called talent and culture, because he sees that human resources is not just a transactional process between, hiring people, offboarding people, but really is something that's at the heart of the culture of an organization. So whether or not you call your human resources or something else like we did at my institution, I would say if you're looking for maybe a point of contact that can pull all of the departments together to support these types of transitions, I would say that maybe you would want to start within your HR department.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our questions. I know that someone did ask about the slides being shared, and yes, we are recording this session, so we will make sure that you get a link to view it again in case there's anything you missed or you just want to go back over. But yeah, just a quick reminder about that short survey that's going to pop up on your screen. We really appreciate your feedback about your experience today, but also potential future sessions that might be of interest to you. Julia and Brian, thank you so much. You've shared some really great information with our attendees today. For all of you who spent an hour of your time with us, we're really thankful and we certainly appreciate it. If you are getting ready for a new role or you're in the midst of a transition, best of luck to you. And if you need a hand, please feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.